Hello and welcome to Gateways to Healing. I'm Scott McGuffey, clinical hypnotherapist and your host. Gateways to Healing is a program at how we look at how you can utilize complementary medicine with Western medical services. In this 8-program series, we explore, introduce, and explain the 4 gateways to healing: mind, body, spirit, and community. Today we're going to open up the gateway of the spirit and look into that and see how that can be used as a positive healing process. And to help me do that are my guests today from Integrated Healing Arts. On my right is Paul Sibsey. He is a spiritual counselor and teacher of meditation and process acupressure, and one of the original founders of Integrated Healing Arts. He is also co-founder of Pathways to Self-Healing, a nonprofit spiritual development organization that emphasizes spirit as a key ingredient for a total health and well-being. And also with us is Dr. Jean Gillespie, who is working toward her license as a clinical psychologist under the supervision of Dr. Nicholas Zerpolo, also at Integrated Healing Arts. Her areas of specialization include working with artists and writers to facilitate their productivity and creativity. And also with us is Rosalie Mangan. She is a clinical hypnotherapist and a human services counselor who includes body therapy techniques in her work with clients. She is one of the original founders of Integrated Healing Arts, an alternative complementary healthcare center in Palo Alto. And thank you all for being here with us this evening. Well, we might as well just jump right into the topics here. It's a fascinating subject, and I'm sure we'll have it quite full at the end of the 30 minutes. As we look at the 4 gateways of healing, the mind, body, spirit, and community, the gateway of the spirit seems to be the most difficult for individuals to discover. The spirit, somewhat like mind energy, appears to be this intangible healing source, which eludes us and remains a mystery. So my first question is, and Paul, I'm going to start off with you, what is the spirit?
Well, I think you defined it to a great deal, Scott. It is intangible, and it's a great mystery. And at the same time, it seems to be the core of our being. It seems to be who we are. And at the same time, it's an energy. I like to think of it as the core intelligence of our total self. And if we're not in touch with that, and if we're not in tune with it and aligned with it, then we tend to be out of balance. And so it is really, I always consider it the most important aspect, because if we don't know who we are, if we're not being ourselves, how can we possibly be fully healthy and expressive as we are?
You know, that's an interesting point. In the other programs, we've been talking about the gateways all leading to a source. Now, do you believe that at the source is a spiritual connection? Is that the essence of the mystery? I
can't see that it could be any other way. You know, it's the one essence that was here before the body was fully grown, before the personality formed, you know, before the emotions found their patterns, before any of our patterns were really developed. And so when we come back into that intelligence of who we are and we begin to express ourselves through it as it, then it can't help but be healthy. And so yes, I couldn't see it anything except the source.
Great. So when we reach that source, that is when the healing really occurs.
Absolutely.
Great. Rosalie, let me just jump down to you. It seems that the spirit is just this wonderful thing. And as Paul pointed out, it is the source. But how do we recognize the gateway? Why has it been left out? Why are we not seeing this gateway? How can we see the gateway of the spirit?
I believe the spirit has been known as by other names. The psyche, the soul, psyche being the same as soul. And it is that mysterious essence that makes up who we are. People don't get in touch with that sometimes until they have something externally that's forcing them to take a look at what is life all about. For some people it might be a crisis, a life crisis that sort of cracks them open, and they begin to ask questions and search for a deeper meaning to themselves. Does that answer your question, or you want me to give you some of the ways that people access that?
I think that's good. Why don't we just go ahead and look a little bit at how people access that, how they become aware. I think a lot of it has to do with awareness and perception, obviously. How do they become aware that this is actually, that they've actually entered into the gateway of the spirit?
I think nature is one source for people. The awesomeness of a sunset, or the sound of a stream, or seeing something bloom from a seed into a flower. Those things are mysterious. And anytime we have a sense of being in the presence of the mysterious, we are in the presence of spirit. So for some people it's nature. Some people contact their spiritual selves through dreams. Dreams have a great potential to teach us. They bypass our linear critical mind and come as spontaneous symbols to teach us something, to help us learn about ourselves or about what direction to take in life, answer some questions that we have, to soothe us in many times. Even though there might be some that are nightmares, they are beneficial also.
Oh, wonderful. And I want to just jump over to Jean, Dr. Gillespie. You work with creativity, and we've heard for centuries about the creative artist who is full of soul or spirit. How do you look at that avenue as a gateway into the spirit?
Well, I think one of the more exciting and satisfying and replenishing ways to access the spirit is through creativity. That great psychologist Benny Goodman once said that everyone needs something which for them slows time's terrible rush. And I think that's a really good statement of what creativity does for people and how it helps us to access this flow of energy that you were talking about, access it directly and experience it and participate in it.
Great. And Paul, you were telling me earlier that you work a lot with body work to access the gateway of the spirit. How do you do that?
Well, Scott, when people come to me, they often come for physical symptoms as well as emotional symptoms, just a lack of meaning and purpose in life. But if it's a physical symptom, I use process acupressure, which is a mind-body-spirit modality to help facilitate an understanding of what this symptom is about. In other words, I look at physical symptoms as an unconscious aspect of that individual wanting to come into manifestation, and therefore spiritual, because its spirit means that aspect of becoming whole and complete. And so whenever I work with someone with a physical symptom, that's what I'm really doing, is asking, what does this have to say to me? What is out of balance? What needs my attention? What needs the client's attention that wants to unfold and become? I think of it a lot like a flower, that's wanting to bloom. We're all these little roses here, and we're all wanting to become our full selves in some way. If we're blocked from being who we are, this is an unhealthy state. This is dis-ease, and we feel that dis-ease, sometimes physically, sometimes emotionally, sometimes mentally. Some way it's going to come out. And so my job, as I see it, is to help find out what that is, and to help this individual become aware of that and begin to unleash that.
It sounds, from what the three of you have just said, is getting back to what you originally said, Paul, was that at the foundation is the source, is the spirit, and it sounds like it kind of trickles back the other way. It's kind of a two-way road through the physical symptoms or mental symptoms or emotional symptoms, that it all kind of leads back into that soul, that spirit. There are many documented stories of people who have experienced life-threatening illness or injury and discovered the gateway of the spirit. I think that's kind of what you were touching on, Rosalie. And some have called this healing phenomenon faith healing. The power of prayer has been brought up more and more in our society, or even the old miracle cure. What I'm curious about is, how is spiritual health related to physical, emotional, community, and mental health? Paul, how would you like to address that?
Well, I think going back to my analogy of the flower is the spirit is of our essence and who we are. And expressing that is so important in our lives. And so I think it relates to all of them, because when we are not healthy, when we're not balanced, aligned, and connected with ourselves, we're not expressing ourselves and who we are. We're not in touch with ourselves. There's a correlation in research between not being able to remember your dreams and a lack of self-awareness, for example. And so if we're not aware of ourselves, then it's very difficult to tell where we're out of balance. And so by coming back to the spirit, all of the being begins to be expressed. And the beautiful thing of it, you've heard of a hologram being, and there are theories that the universe is like a hologram, that every part of it recapitulates the whole.
Right.
And so when we have a model like that, then we see that the whole, holistic health, is about dealing with this thing that we are as a whole being. And that if any part isn't working, then the rest of it's going to be affected. And so at the center of that is spirit. And so when we're not connected with that spirit, then we begin to find the manifestations of that imbalance in other areas of the life. Now we, all of us I think here, look at that imbalance as an entryway, a gateway, if you will, into that person and what is imbalanced in them. And so when we pay attention to that, it's like a little string that's sticking out, and we all can see that little string. It becomes very obvious in our kind of work as we pull that little string and the person opens up, you know. And as Rosalie said, sometimes they're already cracked open.
Yeah.
And so, because life tends to do that. And we tend to look at symptoms as a way that that person has been cracked open. Because most of the time, we won't look at ourselves unless we have to. Carlos Castaneda's Don Juan once said, no one ever volunteers to change. They either kicked into it or tricked into it. Most of the time we see people because they're kicked.
Yeah. And now I want to relate some of this to what you were mentioning earlier, Rosalie, about your dream work. You had mentioned that oftentimes the spirit is reflected in a positive dream or in a nightmare.
Right.
When you work with your clients, how do you see that string, as Paul put it? How does it trip open with the dream work?
I think dreams help give the client a deeper awareness of what's going on inside of themselves. I'll give you an example of a dream. There was a client who was in a difficult state in her marriage, and she had a dream that she was in a house, and the house seemed to belong to her, but it was a disaster inside. The plaster's peeling off of the walls. There's junk everywhere. And she's sort of appalled that she knows this is her house. And she walks into a bedroom, and there are two men there trying to vacuum in the bedroom, every crack and crevice. And she's thinking to herself, what are they doing? This place is ready to fall down. Even the foundation is crumbling. Then she found herself outside, and the house on the outside looks perfectly fine. It's white, but it's square like a box, and has black shutters. So in working with the dream, what came out of that is her view of life was very black and white and square, as we use that slang word, square, and that her marriage was in such a state of disarray. Even the foundation was crumbling, so it hadn't been built on a strong foundation. And all the cleaning up of the corners, because she was seeing a couple of counselors, marriage counselors, who were trying to vacuum out all the corners, wasn't going to work because the foundation wouldn't hold. So that dream was gave her a chance to look at what the true situation was in her life in order to make a decision that is very, very difficult to make. But it gives a sense of freedom once that decision, difficult decision, is made. And it goes against what our culture usually wants us to do and be, what our religions expect of us, what our family expects of us, what our friends expect of us. But those are all the layers of patterning and conditioning that have been laid on us. And underneath that is this spirit, this soul, that has to live its true life. And being in that particular marriage was not a true life for that woman. So in that case, dreams gave her the encouragement, the support she needed to make a decision that was necessary.
And Jean, we were talking earlier this week about a physical experience that you were working with your creativity. How did that work for your client?
Well, first of all, I want to say that the clients that I work with are kind of two different segments. There are artists and writers who come to me very disturbed because they cannot produce, they cannot create, they're blocked. And as they work with that and maybe learn some new ways to access their creativity, you can see them just visibly relax and bloom, like you were saying. The other group of clients that I work with are folks who are not necessarily artists, and what I do is encourage them to use art in similar way to dreams to access what may be going on for them. And I think the client that you're referring to was the woman who had something called Meniere's syndrome, which is an inner ear disorder that causes dizziness. And she was just unable to function, unable to care for her daughter. She had a 5-year-old daughter, just unable to work, unable to go out and visit with friends or do anything. And she reached a point where she became suicidal. And what I started working with her on was doing drawings. And she noticed in her drawings some symbolism that to her signified Judaism. And she shared with me that her mother was Jewish. And her mother had told her never to tell anyone that she was Jewish and not to join a synagogue or let on in any way that she was Jewish because it was dangerous because of what her mother had been through in Europe. So, to make a long story short, she began seeing a rabbi, and she joined a congregation. Her husband converted to Judaism. Her daughter came into the synagogue also, and the Meniere's syndrome disappeared. The symptoms completely disappeared. And so I think it was, I mean, Meniere's tends to do that anyway, kind of come and go mysteriously, but the metaphor is just so powerful that that was an area of imbalance in her life that she rediscovered, and it was a chunk of herself that she finally had access to.
Yeah, it's one of the interesting aspects that I've been discovering while doing these programs is that when you get to the source, there's that wonderful spirit which is there, which I'm sure we don't know how it happens, but it does happen, and we can certainly see the effects, whether it be mental or physical. One of the things I want to come back to is what Paul was talking about, healing the holistic self. And doing my research for this program, I came across a definition. I went to my pocket medical dictionary, pulled it out to look up holistic medicine. This dictionary was published in 1998, so I figured it'd be fairly up to date. But what it said was, and I'll quote here, holistic medicine, medical care which considers the patient as whole, including his physical, mental, emotional, social, and economic needs. And I thought, well, wait a minute. They forgot the spiritual self. And one of the things that's always curious is that in our society is that oftentimes in our Western medicine techniques and, prodding and probing, that we forget that the spirit is there and it's so powerful. How can we nurture this, Paul? How can we support this development? It seems like it has the greatest impact.
Well, I think one of the major problems that we have in our society is the separation. That we become specialized to an extreme. And of course we found the separation of church and state, and we find that in our educational systems, that we're not allowed to pray, we're not allowed to develop the spirit there in any way. And we see people nowadays are talking about the great spiritual crisis that has perhaps spurred such things as this tragedy in Colorado, where these children were killing other children. And so what happens is that we've lost our ability to develop the spiritual self because we have pushed back from the churches. And that's what we've seen. That spirit is developed through religion. So send them to church. And we have a society where great numbers of people, most people, don't go to church. And so we have to find ways in our everyday life to develop that spirit. Now I think that is already happening because our concept of spirituality is changing. We no longer necessarily are limited to the big daddy in the sky with the Apple computer. We begin to see that, wait a minute, man is made, and woman is made in God's image. Yeah. And so as such, we are spiritual by nature. And so,
sorry. Go ahead.
And so we find access to it, for example, through creativity. Anything that helps us unravel that thread back to our center, where the whole is found, is going to be helpful to us. And so it can happen in creativity. We've had writing. We've talked about
meditation.
Analyzing our dreams, looking within ourselves. We've talked about body work, looking into the body, what emotions are happening within the self. So all of this is a way of turning back. And remember that turning back is in spiritual circles is called repent.
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
turn back to the self,
Yeah.
instead of being hypnotized by the outside world. And nowadays we have such a fascination with TV and the news media that the whole world is getting very small, as they say. But what it's doing is dragging us out from who we are, from our center. And if you don't have the center, then you can't hold anything.
Yeah. Jean, you wanted to add to that?
Well, I was just going to say that I think it's really hopeful and helpful that science is starting to look at this, and there are starting to be studies that show very strong effects of spirituality and religion, that people report fewer symptoms, get sick less, recover more quickly if they have any kind of basis in faith or spirituality. It doesn't necessarily have to be a religious belief, but some connection with spirit.
Yeah, as a matter of
good
fact,
for
just from the beginning of this year, I've seen articles in major publications, Time Magazine, the local newspapers, and actually two of my favorite studies, I actually happen to have written them down here, was the Duke University study of 87 patients aged 60 and older, showed that those with the strongest faith recovered quicker from clinical depression. And they ran another study of 5,286 Californians, and that showed that people who practiced some form of spirituality were 25% less likely to die during a 28-year period than those who had no or little spiritual practice. I mean, that's, promoting life itself. As we look at Western medicine, and we're seeing more doctors, more MDs, clinical psychologists, working with the idea that the spirit is there as a healing process, how do you see what you do with your clients furthering that along? Rosalie?
I've worked with some cancer patients, and today oncologists are much more open to looking at and having their patients take part in alternative health care. And for one thing, working with them, listening to what their soul has to say, because the soul needs to have somebody listen. You pay respect by listening to the soul, and that's very nurturing. And if it can't heal cancer, it at least brings some peace and completion to people's lives, which is very valuable. To be able to leave this world with a sense of completion is really important. So some of the work I do has been with cancer patients. And I think also there are many times when we have an illness, a pain, and you go to a standard medical doctor and they do some tests and they really can't find anything wrong, but the pain is real. I think that's a real indication that you might seek out some alternative way, because the spirit again is trying to say something and speaking through this pain. So when you come to someone who works with spirit, you can begin to process what's going on.
And that's kind of like what Paul was talking about earlier, as we see our society today, we're very specialized. And by bringing in the complementary with the Western medical services, there is a powerful healing process which occurs. I wanted to ask you, Jean, how do your clients utilize the Gateway of the Spirit with your writers? And I think that's fascinating with your creative people. It seems like if that is their soul trying to get out, do you also work with the drawings and such? How do you use your creative process to help them find a healing process? And my other question is, how does it affect their lives? Does it change a lot, or?
It has a tremendous effect on people's lives to just discover this whole area in which they can experience so many different kinds of things, like competency, satisfaction, replenishment, and also this sense of connection with something greater than themselves. Artists often report this sensation that I'm not doing this, that this is flowing through me. And there's that kind of experience on the one hand, and on the other hand, they're creating something, a drawing, a poem, a painting, a photograph, whatever, is an act of creation and a way to share in that kind of divine act. I mean, it's a very wondrous and awesome experience. experience for people, and very, it changes people's lives. It enriches their lives.
Yeah.
I might add something to that. To me, creativity is the flow of life. And when we are open to the flow of creativity, all areas of ourselves can be healed, and we have a sense of accomplishment, a sense of course, creativity. But it's like breathing, you know, that's the spirit that works through us. What makes us breathe? Why does our breath go in and out? Sure, the heart beats, but what makes it beat? That's the spirit and as long as we can stay in touch with our creative sense, we can do a lot toward eliminating things like depression. When we're creating, it's pretty hard to be depressed.
Well, in our community now, we just have a few minutes, but I wanted to touch on the community aspect of that. We're seeing that our society is becoming more technological, although there's creativity certainly within technology. But how is that affecting our community, our spiritual community health, Paul?
How is the technology affecting it?
The lack of creativity with the advance of technology, however you want to look at it.
Yeah, I would coming back to the community. One of the things that we do a lot in IHA is we do have community. We meet several times a year for retreats and meetings and that sort of thing. And I have a couple of groups that in Pathways to Self-Healing. I have a meditation group on Thursday night. I teach Kriya Yoga. And on Sunday mornings, we have Sunday Morning for Spiritual Health. And all of these are reaching out or to help people with that need for spirituality, to find themselves, to come home to themselves. Because so often, as you mentioned, I think Rosalie mentioned about cancer or a number of ailments. Our society is very good technologically in solving illnesses quite frequently. And so we have a cancer operation, and many times the recovery begins. But that's a beginning.
Right.
You know, and if we don't look into the center of ourselves as who are we and why did this imbalance occur, then no wonder relapses occur. So that's what we really emphasize, is find out.
Great. Well, it's been wonderful. I want to thank my guests, Paul Sipsey, Jean Gillespie, and Rosalie Mangan. I'm Scott McGuffey, and this is Gateways to Healing, and I ask you to join us next time as we look a little bit more closely into each of the gateways with different modalities and how you can use them with Western medical services. Until then, here's to your health.